Someone has discovered that the story they believed about you was wrong, and the realization has arrived at the exact moment you began imagining a future without them. The Two of Wands is not appearing here as a promise or a prediction. It is a psychological mirror. It represents the moment a person stands between the familiar past and an unfamiliar choice, holding the world in their hands while realizing that every direction now carries a consequence. For a long time, this person thought they understood you. They may have interpreted your silence as indifference, your patience as weakness, or your distance as proof that you never cared. Maybe someone encouraged that belief. Maybe fear filled in the spaces where honest conversation should have been. Or perhaps they needed a version of you that made their own behavior easier to justify. And you felt it, didn't you? You felt them looking at you through a story you never wrote. You tried to explain without begging. You tried to remain kind without abandoning your dignity. You gave them room, time, and more understanding than they recognized. Yet somehow you were still treated as though your heart was questionable. That is where this card changes the emotional landscape. The figure in the Two of Wands is not rushing forward. They are pausing because new awareness has made the old path impossible to follow blindly. Symbolically, this is where that person is now. Something has forced them to compare what they assumed with what you consistently showed them. Your actions do not match the accusation. Your loyalty does not match the rumor. Your withdrawal does not look like manipulation anymore. It looks like exhaustion. And that realization is uncomfortable because once they admit you were genuine, they must also confront what their fear, pride, or outside influence caused them to lose. They are not only reconsidering you, they are reconsidering themselves. But the deepest truth has not surfaced yet. What they are about to understand is why you stopped reaching and why your silence now feels more powerful than every explanation you once gave. Because you did not stop reaching to punish them. You stopped because every attempt to be understood required you to reopen the same wound. The Nine of Wands enters here not as a sign of defeat, but as the psychology of someone who has remained standing for too long. The figure is guarded because experience taught them that openness without safety becomes self-abandonment. That is where you reached your limit. You were still capable of caring. You were simply no longer willing to prove that care to someone committed to doubting it. There is a difference. For a while, this person may have mistaken your endurance for permission. Because you stayed through confusion, they assumed you would always stay through it. Because you returned to the conversation, they believed another misunderstanding could be postponed or explained away. They did not see the private cost of your patience. They saw your presence, but not what it took to keep offering it. And eventually, something in you became quiet. Not cold, not cruel. Quiet. You stopped rehearsing the perfect explanation. You stopped searching for the sentence that might finally make them recognize your intentions. You stopped carrying both sides of a conversation they were afraid to have honestly. Your silence was not designed to create anxiety. It came from accepting that love cannot survive indefinitely, where truth must constantly defend itself. This is what they are beginning to understand now. The Nine of Wands shows the boundary they once misread. What looked like distance was the last form of protection available to you. You were not closing your heart because nothing mattered. You were protecting it because too much had mattered for too long without being handled carefully. And now your absence feels different to them. It does not feel like a game they can wait out. It feels final enough to expose what your presence had been covering. The connection did not sustain itself. You sustained it. That recognition changes the meaning of everything. Because the moment they understand why you stopped reaching, they must face a harder question. Who convinced them that your loyalty was suspicious? And why were they so ready to believe it? It may have been something small at first, a detail that did not fit, a version of events that changed depending on who was listening. A message seen later, outside the emotion of the moment, where the accusation sounded less like truth and more like interpretation. Or perhaps someone finally admitted what they had exaggerated, omitted, or assumed. The Seven of Wands appears here as the psychology of defending a position after the evidence beneath it has begun to weaken. The figure is standing their ground, but the deeper question is whether that ground still belongs to them. This person may have spent so long protecting what they believed about you that changing their mind now feels like losing a battle. But truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through repetition. They remember the conversation where you answered directly and notice that they accused you of avoiding the subject anyway. They remember the moment you could have exposed something private, embarrassed them, or retaliated, and you did not. They remember that even after being hurt, you remained careful with what belonged to them. Your behavior stayed consistent, the story did not. Maybe your silence created the contrast they could not see while you were still present. Without your explanations to argue against, they were left with the consequences of your absence. They began noticing who brought confusion into the connection and who repeatedly tried to reduce it. They saw that the people who questioned your intentions were not offering clarity. They were offering suspicion, and suspicion had become familiar. That is why the Seven of Wands matters here. It reflects the moment they realize they were not defending themselves from you. They were defending a belief from facts that threatened to dismantle it. Every remembered detail now presses against that belief. Every contradiction asks them to step down from a position pride, encourage them to maintain. This is not comfortable recognition. It carries embarrassment. It carries regret. It forces them to revisit moments when your sincerity was visible, yet they chose the explanation that required less vulnerability from them. Because believing you were careless made it easier to remain guarded. Believing you were dishonest made their distance feel justified. Believing the worst protected them from asking whether they had misunderstood someone who was actually trying to love them carefully. And that may be the hardest truth of all. They were not only misled, some part of them needed the lie to be true. Because the lie offered them balance without responsibility. It allowed them to keep one version of you in their mind while avoiding the weight of what your actions actually revealed. The Two of Pentacles appears here as the psychology of emotional juggling. The figure is not choosing between truth and falsehood with clarity. They are trying to keep both in motion. One possibility says you cared, The other says you did not. One memory shows your consistency. Another fear insists there must have been a hidden motive. As long as both remained suspended, they did not have to decide what your sincerity required from them. And that indecision protected something. Maybe it protected them from admitting that this connection mattered more than they wanted it to. Maybe believing you were unreliable gave them permission to remain unavailable. Maybe it made another choice feel easier or allowed them to explain the distance without acknowledging how often they created it. You carried the blame for an imbalance they helped maintain. That was painful, wasn't it? Not only because they misunderstood you, but because they rarely paused long enough to investigate whether their understanding was fair. They reacted to what they feared. They trusted what confirmed it. And pride kept them from asking the questions that might have changed everything sooner. The outside influence mattered, but it was not the entire cause. It only found power because it echoed something already present inside them. An old fear of being deceived. A belief that closeness eventually becomes unsafe. A suspicion that if they cared too deeply, they would lose control. So when someone offered them a reason to doubt you, that reason landed where insecurity had already prepared space for it. This does not excuse what happened. It explains why the truth feels so disruptive now. They are not simply correcting an opinion about you. They are seeing the pattern behind the opinion. They are realizing that fear helped shape their judgment, that avoidance disguised itself as caution, and that pride made uncertainty feel wiser than honesty. The Two of Pentacles cannot keep both stories moving forever. Eventually, one must fall. And now that the false version of you has begun to collapse, their attention is turning back toward your life, toward your energy, toward the future you once imagined including them. Only now, they are beginning to notice that you are no longer waiting in the same place. You have begun returning to yourself. The Queen of Wands appears here as the psychology of reclaimed presence. She is not asking to be noticed. She is no longer measuring her worth by who recognizes it. Her confidence does not come from winning someone back. It comes from remembering that her life remains meaningful even when someone else fails to understand her. That is the change they are seeing. You may be speaking differently now, choosing differently, protecting your time without explaining every boundary. Perhaps you are investing in work, friendships, creativity, or possibilities that had been neglected while so much of your energy was tied to this uncertainty. Even your quietness carries another quality. It is no longer waiting. It is movement. And this person can feel the difference because the attention you once directed toward them is returning to places that can actually receive it. The future you imagined together has not vanished without leaving anything behind. It has become energy you are using to imagine yourself beyond this connection. That unsettles them. For so long, they may have assumed that your care would keep you emotionally available, even while they remained undecided. They believed there would always be another conversation, another opening, another opportunity to reconsider what they had dismissed. But the Queen of Wands does not remain frozen inside someone else's hesitation. She understands that warmth without self-respect becomes depletion. So you did not move forward to provoke jealousy. You did not become stronger to make them regret you. You simply reached the point where your life could no longer be organized around a question they refused to answer, and now the timing becomes impossible to ignore. They are finally seeing your sincerity just as you are becoming less dependent on their recognition. They are finally questioning the story just as you have stopped defending yourself against it. They are considering whether to approach you at the exact moment you are realizing that peace may exist without their return. This does not mean the connections is beyond repair. But the old version of it is, if they come toward you now, they cannot expect to find the person who once accepted uncertainty just to remain close. They will meet someone who still may care, but who no longer confuses caring with waiting. And that forces a more serious question. Do they truly want to repair what happened, or are they only frightened because they can finally see you living without them? That difference will reveal itself through what they are willing to take responsibility for. The Hierophant reversed appears here as the psychology of questioning an old belief system. It represents the moment someone realizes that the rules they followed were never as trustworthy as they assumed. Maybe they listened to advice that valued pride over honesty. Maybe they believed vulnerability meant losing control. Maybe they learned that admitting fault made a person weak, so they protected their image even when the connection was suffering. Now, those beliefs are being challenged. Missing you may create urgency. Loneliness may make them reach for familiar comfort. Fear may produce a message filled with emotion. But none of those things automatically mean they are prepared to treat you differently. There is a difference between wanting access to you and being ready to understand you. Accountability does not hide behind vague regret. It names what happened. It admits where suspicion replaced trust, where silence became avoidance, and where outside influence was accepted because it supported an easier story. It does not place the entire responsibility on another person. It recognizes the choice that was made to believe them. And it respects that you may need time. You are not required to mistake intensity for transformation. Someone can speak urgently because consequences have finally become real. They can miss your attention, your steadiness, or the emotional safety your presence provided without yet understanding what it would take to rebuild trust. Your distance is revealing that now. Before, your patience gave them space to postpone responsibility. Your explanations softened the consequences of their assumptions. Your willingness to return allowed them to believe there would always be another chance to get it right later. But your silence has removed that protection. They can no longer depend on you to carry the emotional weight while they decide whether honesty feels comfortable. The old structure is failing because you are no longer holding it upright alone. That is what the reversed Hierophant exposes. Repair cannot happen through the same beliefs that created the rupture. They must question the pride they called strength, the avoidance they called caution, and the advice they accepted without examining its cost. And somewhere inside them, a decision is beginning to form. Perhaps a message is being written. Perhaps they are searching for the right opening. But the contact itself is not the deepest part. What matters is the truth they are still afraid to say, and that truth may be larger than an apology. Justice reversed appears here as the psychology of someone confronting the imbalance they helped create. It reflects the moment when a person can no longer defend their choices by pointing only to incomplete information, outside influence, or misunderstanding. Somewhere beneath all of that, they knew this connection was asking more from them than casual interest ever could. It was asking for honesty, consistency, a decision, and that may be what frightened them most. Because admitting that you mattered would have required them to become emotionally visible. They would have had to stop standing at a safe distance, stop keeping one foot outside the connection, and stop relying on uncertainty to protect an identity built around independence. So doubt became useful. The more deeply they felt, the more intensely they may have searched for reasons not to trust it. The accusation gave them something concrete to resist. Misjudging you allowed them to avoid confronting how vulnerable your sincerity made them feel. But understanding that does not erase what it did to you. Fear may explain why they withdrew, but it does not undo the moments you questioned your own reality. It does not restore the energy you spent defending intentions that were never dishonest, and it does not turn a vague apology into accountability. They know that now. Perhaps they have rehearsed something simple. I miss you. I have been thinking. Can we talk? But each version feels incomplete because the real admission sits beneath the words. They were not only wrong about your character, they were frightened by the seriousness of what existed between you, and they allowed that fear to become judgment. To say that honestly would expose the part of themselves they worked hardest to protect. And the balance has changed. There was a time when you feared their silence meant you had lost them. Now they are the one wondering whether your peace means you no longer need what they once withheld. They are beginning to understand that your love may have survived the misunderstanding, but your willingness to accept the old dynamic did not. Justice reversed does not allow the imbalance to remain hidden forever, and what has been private inside them is beginning to press toward action. The question is no longer whether they know the truth, it is whether they are finally willing to let you see that they know. That willingness may first appear in small, almost invisible ways. The solar eclipse reversed enters here as the psychology of delayed clarity. Something that was hidden is no longer completely hidden, but the person is still adjusting to the light. They may understand the truth privately before they are ready to stand inside it publicly. So the movement may be subtle. They may return to an old conversation and read your words without the defensiveness they carried before. They may check whether there is still an opening between you. They may ask someone a careful question, not to gather more suspicion, but to confirm what they are already beginning to accept. Perhaps they write a message, delete it, and begin again because every version sounds too safe, too incomplete. Before, their hesitation came from doubting you. Now it comes from knowing you may recognize anything that avoids the real issue. They cannot approach you with half an apology and expect your heart to fill in the missing truth. They cannot speak only about missing you while ignoring what made you leave. And that changes the risk. To contact you honestly, they must surrender control over how you respond. They must accept that truth does not guarantee forgiveness and regret does not restore access. They may finally be ready to admit what happened, but they cannot decide whether you will still want what they are offering. That is the narrow space they are standing in now. You do not need to chase them through it. You do not need to interpret every silence, every indirect gesture, or every shift as proof that something is coming. Their courage is not your responsibility. The truth has already asked enough of you. The reversed eclipse suggests that timing matters, but not because a reunion is promised. It matters because clarity has arrived before the final possibility disappears. This may be just in time for honesty, but only honesty. If they act from panic, they may reach for the version of you who once made everything easier. If they act from truth, they will approach the person you have become and accept that the outcome is no longer theirs to control. And when communication finally happens, the most important change will not be what they confess. It will be what you no longer feel compelled to prove. You no longer need to prove that your intentions were sincere, that your patience had limits, or that your distance came after repeated disappointment. The truth has already reached them. Now behavior must follow it. The King of Pentacles reversed appears here as the psychology of someone realizing that possession is not the same as security. This person may have once believed the connection would remain available because it had remained available before. They may have confused your loyalty with permanence, your understanding with unlimited access, or your love with an agreement to accept whatever they were unwilling to change. But that assumption no longer holds. If communication happens, you may listen without rushing to rescue the moment. You may allow silence to exist without filling it for them. You may hear regret without immediately turning it into reassurance. Not because you want them to suffer, but because their discomfort is no longer evidence that you have done something wrong. That is the shift. Once, you carried the conversation beyond the point where honesty stopped. You softened your needs so they would not feel accused. You explained your pain in ways designed to make it easier for them to receive. And when they withdrew, you often became responsible for restoring the connection they had helped destabilize. You do not carry that responsibility now. The reversed King of Pentacles exposes what happens when someone wants the security of a bond without offering the stability required to protect it. They may finally understand that being wrong about you does not automatically return them to the place they once occupied. Recognition is not repair. An apology is not consistency. Emotion is not a new foundation. And you can see that clearly. This does not make you closed, it makes you discerning. The Two of Wands returns beneath this moment because both of you can now see that another future may still be possible. But neither of you can enter it through the habits that created the past. They cannot return through assumption, avoidance, or entitlement. And you cannot return by abandoning yourself to keep the door open. Everything between you has changed because the imbalance has changed. They discovered the truth, but the most important decision may no longer belong to them. And that is why the Ace of Cups reversed appears here. It is not a symbol of love disappearing. It is the psychology of emotion that can no longer be poured into a container that does not protect it. For too long, your care may have been offered into uncertainty, misunderstanding, or silence. You kept hoping that sincerity would eventually create safety. But sincerity cannot do that alone. The truth has arrived just in time because you were beginning to mistake their judgment for something you had to carry forward. You may have wondered whether you had been too much, not enough, too patient, too distant, too difficult to understand. Their assumptions began following you into the future you were trying to build without them. Now that burden can be set down. They know your silence was not indifference. They know your withdrawal did not begin where your feelings ended. It began where your emotional safety did. And whether they say that clearly or only reveal it through changed behavior, their realization removes the false story from your hands. What happens next depends on more than emotion. An opening may still exist, but you are free to examine it differently now. Does their behavior remain consistent after the urgency passes? Can they name what happened without rewriting it again? Can they respect your boundaries without treating them as punishment? Can the connection hold honesty without requiring you to disappear inside it? Those questions do not close the door. They protect what enters. The reversed Ace of Cups reminds you that love cannot be restored merely by returning it to the same conditions that caused it to spill. If this connection is rebuilt, it must be rebuilt with accountability, steadiness, and room for both people to remain whole. And if it is released, that release does not mean the connection was meaningless. It means its lesson no longer needs to become your future. The Two of Wands stands behind this final choice. One path may lead toward a relationship formed on new terms. The other may lead toward peace without them. Neither path requires you to keep defending a heart that has already proven itself through action. They found out the truth. Everything between you has changed. And it happened just in time for you to understand that the next chapter is not determined by whether they return. It is determined by what you choose now that you finally know you were never who they believed you were.